They went to church with Wade's mother's parents.
So that was how they connected and ended up raising Wade Wilson?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, do they have any other children?
Yes, ma'am, 2 daughters.
There are criminal cases that disappear into the thousands of pages of court records. There are cases remembered only by investigators and the families who were left behind. And then there are cases that escape the courtroom. Cases that become headlines. Cases that become arguments. Cases that become viral videos, social media discussions, petitions, and endless speculation. The case of Wade Stephen Wilson became one of those cases. But behind the internet attention was something far more serious. 2 women were killed in Cape Coral, Florida, on the same day. Their names were Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz. And for investigators, the challenge was not simply to determine who was responsible. It was to reconstruct what happened during a terrifying sequence of events on October 7th, 2019. The story would eventually lead to an arrest, then an indictment, then a murder trial, and finally, 2 death sentences. But before any of that happened, there were 2 ordinary lives. 2 women who had families, people who knew them, people who expected to see them again, and people who would spend years waiting for answers. This documentary examines a publicly documented timeline of the Wade Wilson case. It is not a celebration of the offender. It is not an attempt to turn violence into entertainment. And it is not a substitute for the court record. Instead, we're going to examine how investigators reconstructed the events, how the prosecution presented its case, what the defense argued, what the jury decided, and why this case became such a controversial phenomenon.
And again, was that a car you had ever seen before?
No.
Now, when you got there, did you get out and try to talk to him?
Yes.
And again, what were you trying to talk to him about?
And online. Because sometimes the most disturbing part of a crime isn't what happened in a single moment. It's how many small pieces had to come together before investigators could finally see the whole picture. Cape Coral is a city built around water. Canals cut through neighborhoods. Roads connect residential communities, commercial areas, and nearby Fort Myers. On an ordinary day, it can feel far removed from the kind of crime story that dominates national headlines. But on October 7th, 2019, investigators would begin piecing together a sequence of events that would eventually become one of the area's most closely followed homicide cases. The first victim was Kristine Melton. The second was Diane Ruiz. According to prosecutors and court records, the 2 women had no apparent connection to each other. Their connection would come through the person investigators identified as their killer, Wade Wilson. At the time, Wilson was a young man with a criminal history. But the events of October 7th would change the course of several lives forever. For investigators, the first challenge was understanding what had happened to Kristine Melton. She was found dead inside her Cape Coral home. The circumstances immediately raised serious questions. Who had been with her? How had the person responsible entered the home? What had happened during the hours before her death? And where was her vehicle? Those questions would eventually lead investigators beyond Melton's house.
To the dress, he opens the car door, obviously forgets to put it in park. The car starts to roll forward. He tackles me to the ground. The car grazes both of our legs and I'm pummeled to the ground.
How hard did he push you to the ground?
I'm sorry, I don't recall. This is also fast and he's very heavy and I'm 5'2", he's 6'6", so.
Now, what happens after you are pushed to the ground?
I start to get beat.
Okay. Describe what you mean when you say he was beating you.
It all went so fast and so slow, whether it be punches, slapping, choking, that kind of nature. Yes.
Now, you mentioned that the fight is happening around the car. Does the fight move at some point?
Yes, so I either get dragged, pulled, can't remember, by my hair, arm, or dress, I'm trying to reason with him, trying to talk to him, but there's nobody behind those eyes anymore. So there was no reasoning with him. I got to the front of the staircase, and I'm holding on to that. And a crowd begins to develop, I'm expecting people to help, call 911. So I'm just trying to bide my time at that point as quickly as help can get there. And that's not working either. I'm starting to get punched and grabbed and choked and all kinds of things again. Somehow we move up to the upper level. I'm trying to convince him, let's just go in Mila Spa. We'll talk about it there. We're safe there.
Melissa, you have phone records and physical evidence. And somewhere in that information is a sequence that explains how one event led to another. The investigation would eventually reveal that Wilson did not simply disappear after Melton's death. According to prosecutors, he drove the stolen vehicle to another location. There, he encountered his girlfriend, and what happened next would become another important piece of evidence. The girlfriend would later contact law enforcement. Her account helped investigators understand what Wilson was doing after leaving Melton's home. And then there was another problem. A second woman had disappeared. Her name was Diane Ruiz. At first glance, these could have looked like separate incidents. A woman found dead at home. Another woman missing. Different locations. Different circumstances. But investigators began connecting the dots. And when the dots began forming a line, that line led back to Wilson. Diane Ruiz was 43 years old. She was walking in Cape Coral when, according to prosecutors, Wilson encountered her. He stopped. He asked for directions. And investigators say that interaction was the beginning of a second deadly encounter. Ruiz entered the vehicle. From there, the prosecution presented evidence describing a violent attack. We are deliberately not recreating those moments. There is nothing necessary about showing violence in graphic detail to understand the significance of the evidence. The important fact is that Ruiz did not return home. Her family began looking for her, and investigators began trying to determine where she had gone. The search would eventually lead to the discovery of her body. That discovery transformed the investigation. 2 women, 1 day, 1 suspect, and a rapidly developing case. The state attorney's office later said that Cape Coral Police and Fort Myers Police worked together to investigate the homicides. That cooperation became critical because a case involving 2 victims requires investigators to determine not only who committed each crime, but whether the crimes are connected. Evidence from one location may explain another. A witness who seems unrelated may become important later. A vehicle may provide a physical link. A statement may reveal knowledge that only someone involved could reasonably possess. And every piece of evidence has to survive scrutiny. This is where homicide investigations stop being simple stories. They become timelines. Let's step back, because understanding the timeline is essential. The evening of October 6th, Wilson encounters Melton. They eventually go to her home. Then comes October 7th. Melton is found dead. Her vehicle is taken. Wilson is subsequently seen elsewhere. Then investigators say he encounters Diane Ruiz. Ruiz disappears. Her body is later discovered. 4 days after the events began, investigators had a case involving 2 homicide victims. But they still needed to establish responsibility. And that's where forensic investigation becomes crucial. The public often imagines criminal cases being solved by one dramatic clue. A fingerprint, a confession, a surveillance camera. Sometimes that happens, but many cases are solved through accumulation. A piece of information here, a witness statement there, a vehicle, a phone, a forensic result, a contradiction, a timeline, and eventually enough evidence to create a coherent explanation. In Wilson's case, investigators eventually identified him as a suspect. The Lee County grand jury indicted him in November 2019. The charges included 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was also indicted on charges involving a motor vehicle, battery, burglary, and theft. The prosecution would later seek the death penalty. But an indictment is not a conviction. The case still had to survive the courtroom. Once investigators had identified Wilson as their suspect, the case entered a new phase. The investigation became a prosecution. Evidence that had been collected by detectives now had to be presented according to strict legal standards. Witnesses could be questioned. Forensic experts could be challenged. Statements could be examined. And the defense would have the opportunity to contest the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. This distinction matters. A detective may believe a suspect committed a crime. A prosecutor may believe they can prove it. But the ultimate question belongs to the jury. Can the evidence establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? That question would eventually become the central issue of the 2024 trial. The crimes happened in 2019. The trial did not begin until 2024. 5 years. For the victims' families, that meant years of waiting. 5 years during which the allegations remained unresolved in a courtroom. 5 years before a jury would hear the evidence. And during those years, the case accumulated another layer. Public attention. Wilson's appearance changed dramatically during his incarceration. His tattoos became part of the public fascination surrounding him. And eventually, the case acquired a disturbing internet identity. People began discussing Wilson not simply as a defendant in a double homicide case, but as an internet personality. That phenomenon would become controversial, because there is a fundamental difference between studying a criminal case and turning convicted murderer into an object of fascination. The victims cannot participate in the online conversation. They cannot correct misinformation. They cannot respond to comments. They cannot tell their own stories. That's why responsible true crime should always return to the people who were harmed. Kristine Melton was not a headline. Diane Ruiz was not a headline. They were human beings, and the case was ultimately about their deaths. In June 2024, after years of investigation and legal proceedings, Wade Wilson went on trial. The prosecution presented its case. The defense challenged it. Jurors heard testimony from witnesses connected to the events. They heard forensic evidence. They heard about the circumstances surrounding both deaths. And they heard arguments about Wilson's mental state and behavior. The trial was not simply about whether two women had died. Everyone knew they had. The question was, who was responsible? And was the prosecution's evidence sufficient to establish first-degree murder? The jury listened. They considered the evidence. And eventually, they were asked to make a decision. On June 12, 2024, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. 2 counts of first-degree murder. The jury also convicted Wilson on the additional charges involving theft of a motor vehicle, battery, burglary, and petty theft. The verdict brought an end to the guilt phase. But the case was not over, because Florida law allows the death penalty in certain capital murder cases. And the next question was whether Wilson should live out his life in prison or die by execution. The penalty phase would be different. Now the jury would consider aggravating and mitigating circumstances. The prosecution would argue for death. The defense would argue for mercy. And once again, the courtroom would become the center of the case. The penalty phase forced the jury to confront a question far different from guilt. A person can be found guilty, but sentencing asks another question. What punishment is justified? The prosecution presented aggravating circumstances. The defense presented mitigating evidence. Among the defense arguments were issues concerning Wilson's background and neurological condition. A defense neurologist testified about possible brain abnormalities. A medical examiner disagreed with that interpretation. These disagreements were important because they went directly to one of the central questions of sentencing. Could anything in Wilson's history justify a sentence other than death? The jury ultimately recommended death for both murders. According to the state attorney's office, the recommendation was 9-3 for Melton's murder and 10-2 for Ruiz's murder. The recommendation was not the final sentence. That decision belonged to the judge. On August 27, 2024, Judge Nicholas Thompson imposed 2 death sentences. The judge concluded that the aggravating factors outweighed the mitigating circumstances. Wilson was also sentenced on the additional criminal charges. The courtroom phase of the case had reached its most consequential point. But legally, it still wasn't the end, because a death sentence automatically enters another stage. Appeal. Wilson's case moved into the Florida appellate system, and as of 2026, the case remains before the Florida Supreme Court. His attorneys are challenging the death sentence. The appeal does not erase the convictions. It is a separate legal process examining whether the sentence complied with Florida law and constitutional requirements. That distinction is important. A criminal case does not necessarily end when a judge announces a sentence. Sometimes a legal battle continues for years. Perhaps the strangest chapter of the Wade Wilson story isn't inside the courtroom. It's online. The case attracted enormous attention on social media. But some of that attention focused less on the victims and more on Wilson himself. His appearance, his tattoos, his photographs, his personality, and the phenomenon surrounding his name created a troubling question. Why do people become fascinated with violent criminals? Sometimes it is curiosity. Sometimes it is the psychology of evil. Sometimes it is attraction to notoriety. And sometimes the internet simply turns a serious criminal case into another form of entertainment. But there's a danger in that transformation. When a murderer becomes a celebrity of a true crime story, the victims can disappear from the narrative. And that is something worth resisting. Because the most important names in this story aren't the ones printed on merchandise or repeated in viral posts. They are Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz. The case took years to reach the courtroom, but no verdict can reverse time. No sentence can restore life. And no amount of internet discussion can change what happened on October 7th, 2019. What the legal system can do is establish responsibility. It can hear evidence. It can determine guilt. It can impose punishment. And it can preserve a record of what happened. In June 2024, a jury found Wade Wilson guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. In August 2024, a judge sentenced him to death for both murders. And today, the case continues through the appellate process. But perhaps the most important lesson from this case isn't about Wilson at all. It is about how quickly ordinary life can change. Kristine Melton went to sleep expecting another day. Diane Ruiz was walking through her community. Neither knew that their names would eventually become part of a nationally discussed criminal case. And neither could have known how many people would later talk about the events surrounding their deaths. That is why true crime should be approached carefully. Behind every headline is a person. Behind every photograph is a life. Behind every case number is a family. And behind every courtroom verdict are consequences that continue long after the cameras leave. The Wade Wilson case became famous because of violence. Then it became famous because of the internet. But before the headlines, before the courtroom, before the tattoos, before the social media debates, there were 2 women, Kristine Melton, Diane Ruiz, and that is where this story should end. Not with fascination for a killer, but with remembrance of the people whose lives were taken. The legal case continues through the appellate process, and whatever happens next in court, the event of October 7th, 2019, remain a permanent part of the lives of the families who survived them. Some mysteries remain unsolved. Some cases remain disputed. But in this case, a jury heard the evidence and reached its verdict. And now the legal system continues with the next chapter.